My cave guide at Waitomo realised I was interested in what was happening deep inside these limestone caves. So he took me through a series of focal points in the sound. The flowstone was one, the cathedral was another one. So they were giving them acoustic descriptions to the names. This great domed shape, this interior cave with this very cathedral-like acoustic, but animated by the movement and dripping of water in the place. And another place called the Flowstone, where there was also a little stream. So there was some very particular, interesting and engaging sonic characteristics. Remarkably as well, the reason I felt this place was a haunted space were there inscriptions that had been written there by British naval officers from a couple of hundred years ago who'd visited, one of the first Europeans to visit this cave. It had been well known by Maoris for a very long time and regarded as a sacred place, not just a haunted space by them. And there were also some other interesting bits of cave art there, and actually as well as the bones of a dodo, an animal that's now extinct. So I was fascinated by what had washed up into that place and the memories which it held. There's one very particular and special cave acoustic that I really wanted to include as a haunted space because it haunts my memory, having spent time in there. On Borneo, on the island of Borneo, in the Sabah region, is the Gomatong caves, which are inhabited by tens, if not hundreds of thousands of bats, and also swiftlets, these cave swiftlets, these tiny birds whose nests contribute to bird's nest soup. But the acoustic of that vast space was remarkable, and it's infused by these super high frequency content, this constant whirring and squeaking of the tens of thousands of bats which were directly over my head when I was making those recordings. You don't really get to see them, but you get this sense that they're all around you. They feel this presence, and it's almost like this high frequency energy sort of pressing down on you, this constant, I'm sure a lot of it's ultrasonic, this very high frequency rains down along with all the bat droppings which rain down on you. And then in the evenings the place switches because the bats start to migrate out of the cave and the cave swiftlets come back in to roost. So the acoustics of the same place vary remarkably. They toggle between the day and night, between the bats and the swiftlets. And it was another place where it was a relatively unattended recording. I went in and put the microphones there, but the stench is so bad in there with all this mountain of guano, bat guano and bird guano, that I went in there and spent about 10 minutes covering my face and mouth, and then went out, left it running and came back in to collect it. But again was fascinated by the density of high frequency sound in the space, which was quite remarkable. I remember when I was much younger hearing Friedrich Mendelssohn's The Hebridean Suite and his reimagining of the cave on the island of Staffa, Fingal's Cave. And I really thought, it captured that sense of space, but also the ebb and flow of these huge waves which have crossed the Atlantic Ocean, waves which started off the coast of Maine and New England and have crossed the trackless Atlantic. And one of the first places they hit is the island of Staffa, and there's this very long wavelength flow into the cave. I've never had the opportunity of visiting Fingal's Cave, but I was on the island of Handa, an uninhabited island to the north, which is on a similar longitude. It's another place where the Atlantic swell flows in and out of. And there's a sea cave on Handa, which is not only occupied by the voice of the Atlantic Ocean, it's full of seabirds as well, in this black hole of a space where I climbed to the top of and put a pair of microphones underneath. And again, I was fascinated because I saw nothing in this place. It was a bit like recording in tropical rainforest. It was so dark. When I put my microphones in, I couldn't see any of these sounds, but I could hear this real cacophony backed by the ebb and flow of the Atlantic Ocean as it tracked in and out of the cave. Iceland, yeah, what a fantastic place. Land of ice and fire. One of my favourite places to go recording. I try and go, well, most years, sometimes a couple of times. And I just love it because there is so much there. I love the culture and the place. And most of all, I love the sound, or the sounds of that country. And one of the sounds that characterises it is, of course, ice and water. And I think the year before last, when I was up there, we got invited into a hydroelectric power station where they take the water that flows out of Thingvellir, again, famous place, and a place that is full of the Icelandic spirit. It's where the Icelandic Parliament met. It's the meeting point of the tectonic plates of North America and Europe. It's this incredibly powerful environment. The water flows down through Thingvellir and into this hydroelectric power station and then descends. So I was interested in capturing the sound of this spirited water through this vertical descent. And so there are a couple of tracks in there on level 1, and then some pressure valves, the sounds of some pressure valves. And then finally, deep underground in the rocks around this valley surrounding Thingvellir is this escape tunnel. So the water that's powered the turbines is released back into the river. But if ever there's any problem with that, or the volume of water, there's this huge tubular escape tunnel for which first people and then the water can escape up through in the event of some emergency. And that just seemed to me held this amazing sense of presence, because hopefully it's a place that will never get used, but it's just there, this tube carved out of the solid black rock, just waiting to be filled, first of all with people and then maybe water. So it's charged with a very particular spirit, I felt. The natural conclusion of a lot of water and ice in Iceland is when it enters the sea. And I've recorded on the Vatnajökull Glacier for other Sonicature projects. I also had the opportunity on that last trip of recording the melted water, the meltwater of the glacier in the Jökulsárlón lagoon. And what was interesting to me there was that these shards of glacial ice were entering the brackish water of the Sea of Norway and melting literally in front of my eyes. So I dropped my hydrophones in, first of all to just 1 meter, had some floats, just plastic Coke bottles as floats to dangle the hydrophones 1 meter below the surface, and got this really tuneful, beautifully harmonically rich pulsing of escaping air from the melting ice. What I didn't realise at the time, and then speaking to a glaciologist, was that's the first time that air has been released back into the environment in something like 10,000 years, because it was frozen with the ice at the top of the glacier, and it takes about 10,000 years for a piece of ice to make that journey. And I was just looking at the water and seeing these bubbles and imagining this air being released back into the 21st century environment, having been trapped in the ice for 10,000 years. And then subsequently the second track is a much deeper recording when I lowered my hydrophones to about 3 meters down in this glacial lagoon and got sounds from a much wider field, but effectively the same source, but just from a greater depth. Paris is one of my favourite European cities. It's ancient and has this remarkable history, but also has very special acoustics across from the built environment to the open spaces. And the Pompidou Centre has that. It's a really good haunted space, and it's simply reflected in the acoustic of that environment. There are other places in Paris, like the Gare du Nord, which features, which is another place which has embodied that same sort of character and really powerful sense of space that a lot of locations in Paris seem to hold. But that track in particular, the Pompidou Centre, as I was recording it, I remember standing there. I was only 20 metres away from the microphone, and I was just totally engaged in this sort of magical flow around the environment. I always try and record out of hours because normally in cities, quite often, the signature sounds and acoustics are masked, they're smeared by traffic noise and sometimes people. So the Pompidou Centre, I was choosing to record later on in the evening. So you really help to get a sense of space, because sometimes those fine details in the acoustic are just masked by loud sounds, particularly of traffic. And so you have to choose your moments in those places quite carefully. Orford Ness, what an amazing place. The island of secrets, been inhabited by the military since the First World War. A wall around the island built by forced Chinese labour has this really dark history on the place, where the British military up until the 1960s practiced the very dark arts of warfare, in particular researching atomic weapons, effectively stress testing them. And so the testimony now is that the National Trust, who now own the place, it's not really an island, it's this shingle spit. I think it's the longest shingle spit in Europe. It stretches 16 kilometres down from Aldeburgh, and the access is across by a small ferry across from Orford to Orford Ness. But the shingle, the low-lying shingle, has been built upon in decades past by military buildings housing the Atomic Warfare Research Station, which is what Orford Ness is now famous for, and particular buildings. And each building, apart from the history that it presents and the darkness of that history, has very special acoustics. So the centrifuge, which is obviously a circular building inside, has this very reverberant but dark bottom end sound to it. The laboratories, which the activities which were unknown to me, also are haunted by whatever happened in there. And I imagine this sort of long decay of sound, as well as the long decay of the buildings, because they're literally falling back into the environment. They've been left there as testimony to what happened and not demolished, but allowed to decay back into the environment. And the great pagodas which stood over the weapons as they were tested environmentally. One of the spaces you walk into, and I was immediately brought to a halt, because what I was looking at was this device about 6-7 feet long. It was a decommissioned nuclear weapon, which is just parked up there in the space and just sits there brooding and letting your imagination run wild into what's inside that and inside the space and what it could have done. I'm a great fan of the films of the Coen brothers and David Lynch, and the recording I made in the Sand Hills Motel in Nebraska could have been in either of those directors' films. It was right alongside a railway line, a train that came out of nowhere across the plains of Nebraska, but one of those amazing Midwestern trains that would just go on and on and on and on forever and just vibrate the whole building, and certainly my hotel room. I mean, I was woken up several times each night when I was in there, and this is one of the recordings from the middle of the night with this thunderous roar of this train coming from who knows where and going to who knows where and carrying tons and tons of something, and these lines of trucks rolling past as if it was literally outside the bedroom window, but had this incredibly powerful force that not only kept me awake, but reminded me of what just was out there. A few years ago, I was recording lesser flamingos in Lake Bogoria in Kenya, East Africa, on the Rift Valley. And Patrick, who I was working with, my guide locally, was telling me about a place on the very southern end of Lake Bogoria, a place where people don't go, a place literally off the track. But he knew I was interested in this sense of spirit and place, and he took me to this place called Mawe Moto, in Swahili, meaning the place, the talking stones. And it's a place where some of the Rift Valley is a volcanic valley, and there is still evidence of hot springs and gases emanating both within Lake Bogoria, which makes it inhabitable for flamingos, but for very little else. It's a very alkaline lake. But these springs also occur around the edge, and there was this one area of broken rocks which were literally alive with the hissing and bubbling of hot gases and steam emanating from the ground. And Patrick was telling me that these were caused not by volcanic activity, but it was the voices of a previous tribe who had inhabited the Rift Valley, who had crossed a lot of people, and so their gods had compressed them into the ground. They'd eradicated them from the surface of the earth. But these people were still so angry that you could hear their voices and feel their anger coming up through the ground and the stones. And that's what was represented by the sort of hissing and boiling and rumbling and growling sounds. It was the voices of these people emanating through these talking stones. Some time ago, I made some sound recordings on a railway line across Mexico from Los Mochas to Veracruz. And on the approach to Veracruz, you start to enter a tropical habitat, and the line passes quite close by to an Aztec city, El Tajín, which has now been overgrown. But what still exists are these remarkable pyramidal shapes with the huge stones on them, which reflect the sounds of the jungle and the forest. And I went there again after hours at night, and it's really quite bizarre, creepy place, because for me, a lot of the sounds in Europe, I know what a lot of the animal sounds are like, but in places like the jungles of South America, Central and South America, I felt very unfamiliar with the place and actually quite threatened by that environment at night. But I was really keen to capture that sense and spirit of place, particularly around the stones of the city, around El Tajín, which is starting to become overgrown. So it's a mixture of the sounds of the jungle at night, but modulated by these huge stones which go to make up the pyramid. I worked on a project with an athlete, a marathon runner, a film project, where at a sports science centre here in Newcastle upon Tyne, where his body was covered in sensors, maybe 12, 18 different sensors, which monitored all his activities. He was on a treadmill. What was really interesting, and that's something I'd not thought about before, but when he was running, all these monitors were being activated, and they were the sort of stick-on ECG style monitors. But what they developed there in this sports laboratory was the ability to sonify the data, so that they, instead of having to look individually at each dial or output, the scientists could assess what was going off by different sounds, different tones. And so it was just filled with these different tones coming from this athlete internally into these devices, and then being sonified. And it certainly had this really interesting musicality to it. So the internal spirit of this athlete was being realized through these sounds electronically.
They're synthesized,
yeah, they are. Yeah, the synthesized sounds which come from the sensors. But the purpose of it is, it's that you simply can't look at a whole bank of things when you're taking notes. So they were listening to what was going off. So they had the ability to focus particularly then on to one or the other.